Hi, welcome to our focus on speaking. And just like with the other 3 skills that we've covered in our methods course, we're going to spend 2 weeks on speaking. And this first week, what my goal is to give you some highlights from second language acquisition research that really kind of help you anticipate what you'll be looking at, looking for, listening for, and doing when you are supporting English language learners with their development of speaking. So this week, just like the other first weeks, pretty abstract, pretty theoretical, and for most of you, what should happen is you're really seeing a connection with second language acquisition. And then after you finish this week's work and we carry out our discussion, of course, next week I'll meet you in another lecture in which we look at how do you structure speaking lessons? What kinds of things do you actually do? But this week it's still more abstract. So the first thing that I really wanted to say is that we don't think too much about the skill of speaking until we encounter a student who's really struggling with it in English. And once we do, I think the question that comes up for us is, how do you move from a non-speaker to a speaker, or from a very hesitant, slow speaker to a fluent speaker? How does that happen? And so the place to begin our kind of exploration of that question, even before you are faced with it with your own students, is to take a look at the 3 different models that people have reached for when they've thought about this question. How do you move from a non-speaker to a speaker? People have approached from a behaviorist approach. Let's take a look. Let's put this up here so I can write a little bit more. And I've got a picture of a robot up there, and that is supposed to be kind of very full of meaning, in that it's a view of people as simply developing programmed habits, right? It's about developing preferred behaviors. And so the behaviorist model is what audiolingualism, the method audiolingualism, is kind of grounded in, for example. And it's very much a view of simply students needing to repeat, practice, so that they can internalize language, and thus they can begin to produce language. And so behaviorism is very much a view of your student as kind of a robot. And the focus, there's one focus we can take. At least there's one focus that I suggest you can take from this view, and that is the idea that we do need practice. We do need our mouths to get comfortable starting to say words. We do need to begin to say words more quickly, and functional language more quickly, and sentences more quickly. So I do think there's something we can take from this, but not much. For me, it's just this idea of practice. Okay, so let's move on. With each of these, where there's going to be more and more that second language acquisition tells us we should really be using to approach the problem of how do we move our non-speakers to be speakers. So, so the next approach is what's called the mentalist approach. Oh, sorry, wrong mentalist. Let's see, here we go. There we go. So the mentalist approach is very much this idea of there is this black box in a human brain that is primed and ready to learn language. Names like Noam Chomsky should come up for you, and Stephen Krashen. And the method that came out of this approach, the primary method, is the natural approach, which was created by Stephen Krashen. And with the mentalist approach, it's very much a belief that input matters, that if you provide enough input for students in English as non-speakers, they will eventually, when they're ready, when they've got enough input, they will eventually speak, right? That will become output. So the mentalist approach is very much this idea, just like I've chosen an image of a brain here, it's very much this idea that the brain is ready, it's ready to do its work of learning a language and eventually being able to produce a language. We simply need an environment that's the correct one, which is enough input. And of course, Krashen got us to think about the difference between, yeah, I spelled that right, input and intake. So let's go back. For those of you who took second language acquisition in the fall, kind of take your mind back. What is that difference? Input is what's in the environment, right? So if you're sitting in a classroom and you're learning English, it's all the English happening around you all the time. Intake is what you are actually able to do something with. And Stephen Krashen, who approached with a mentalist model, he believed that we had to feel comfortable as language learners. We had to bring down, he called it the affective filter, to make ourselves kind of comfortable and able to take in enough intake. He also believed that it had to be just the right level. He said I+1, where the student is, and just a little bit higher. And he said it had to be comprehensible. So we need to feel comfortable, it needs to be just the right level, we need to be able to understand it. It's all of those factors that move us from input to intake, okay? And so there's a lot there that we can take in. We need to pay attention to how students feel. So I'm going to put affective filter here. We need to pay attention to how they feel. And we do need to make sure that there is input and intake for our students. If there isn't, there is absolutely no chance that students will move from non-speakers to speakers, right? They need to actually be taking in some kind of input. So and it needs to become intake. So we've got some pieces there that we need to bring with us to this lecture today as we're thinking through second language acquisition. And then we have the interactionist model, and I've got a picture here to put up. And what I chose is a dialogue bubble. And the interactionist model is the approach that if students are not producing some language, if they are not speaking, they will not develop as speakers, right? Now with the mentalist model, you don't need to speak at all. But with the interactionist model, you do need to actually speak. It's through the speaking that you are actually growing. And so we use words like output, right? Students need to actually be producing some kind of output. And another aspect of that output is that sometimes communication will break down between students, or it might even break down between the teacher and a student. But the interactionist model doesn't see this as a problem. It actually sees it as an opportunity to move forward in understanding. Because the interactionist model is built on this idea that we all have hypotheses in our minds about how a language that we're learning works. Like right now, I have all these hypotheses about how Spanish works. Some of them are correct, and some of them aren't correct. When I produce output in Spanish, when I am actually saying something in Spanish, and it could be writing, but our focus today is on speaking. When I am producing speaking in Spanish, there's a few things that can happen. And one thing that can happen is that there can be a breakdown in meaning between me and another student. And so that is an opportunity for what's called negotiation of meaning. And negotiation of meaning, probably heard this term before, either in this class in our very first week or in second language acquisition previously. Negotiation of meaning is when two people are attempting to communicate and at least one of them is a non-native speaker of the language. There's some kind of breakdown and the two do some kind of dance to figure out how to fix the communication breakdown. Now, what's really interesting about the process is what's going on inside of the language learner. So let's take me in Spanish. If I'm having a conversation with you in Spanish and I attempt to say something, you let me know you don't understand. What do? I try it a different way. And then I see if that works. Maybe it does. Maybe it doesn't. If it doesn't, I'm going to try it a little bit differently. I'm going to try something else. Ah, that one worked. What do I now know? I know two things. I know that my original hypothesis about how Spanish worked in that way isn't correct. And because you gave me, through that natural communication, you gave me some feedback on what did get closer to meaning, I now at least know a direction to go. I don't necessarily know the right form, the correct form, the kind of final form that I'll end up at, but I'm a lot closer. That is negotiation of meaning, and that is why breakdowns in communication that happen when students are speaking is actually a great thing. Another thing that happens when we are bringing about communication in our classrooms, especially between students, is a student will notice that the way they say something is different than the way someone else is saying something. That's called noticing or noticing the gap. And so this often happens for me in Spanish. When I'm in Nicaragua, I'll say something, and then down the road, maybe later that day, later that conversation, maybe just a few minutes later, I'll hear someone say something very similar. Maybe I know that they're meaning the same thing that I attempted to mean, and I'll hear that they're saying it just slightly differently. And a couple of things can happen. I will notice that, and I might actually move forward in getting a little bit closer to what the correct form is, right? The more formal form. And so that is called noticing or noticing the gap. And those are huge ideas that we can take from second language acquisition research. Things that have been found to actually play out, and I've seen from my own experience with second language learners in our classrooms, that make a big difference in them moving forward, especially moving from non-speakers to speakers, moving from those just emerging speakers to really beginning to speak fluently. So those make a really big difference. And the interactionist approach, and as you can see, as you can guess, most of what we're going to take today is from the interactionist approach. A method actually tumbled out of this approach, and you've already taken a look at it either this first week of this class or in the second language acquisition course, which is the communicative method. And so let me put that down here, the communicative method. So for those of you who are Spanish or French majors, for example, you've probably taken GNML 390, and that methods course is entirely focused around the communicative method, which this will just kind of give you some insight. So that means that you're being encouraged to approach the teaching of French or the teaching of Spanish entirely from an interactionist perspective, from this idea that there has to be speaking, otherwise there won't be learning, that it's actually an integral part of what's happening. Some other things I wanted to mention about the interaction approach is that there's also a role for the teacher in providing feedback to students, of course, in a language class, especially one that has any focus at all on speaking. There needs to be some kind of interaction and feedback with the teacher. Now, what kind of feedback do you think teachers were getting, whoops, let me move this, in a behaviorist classroom, so an audiolingualism classroom? Just take a moment and think. What kinds of things do you think the teacher did? Probably what you're thinking of right now is correct, and that is that they gave very explicit, immediate corrective feedback. So the teacher would be very inclined to immediately stop the student and say, "You're saying it wrong, say it this way," right? That's not the way we say it. And of course, why would a teacher do that? I mean, it seems humiliating to me, but why would a teacher do that? A teacher would do that if they were approaching from an idea that knowing a language is just having a collection of good behaviors in that language, and that you need to weed out immediately bad habits before they before they really take over and they become a part of the student's language learning. And so that type of response to a student is called explicit feedback or explicit correction or explicit negative correction, any of those. And when we moved in the 1970s and the 1980s, early 1980s, when we moved to a mentalist model, of course, this was all about how students felt, and at least partly. And so assaulting students so quickly with negative feedback, especially when they don't even need to produce anything, according to this model, to actually be learning, it just didn't make sense. And so in the, up until the late 1960s, teachers would have immediately been harsh and corrective and negative in their feedback, and then that went away in the 1970s and the early 80s. What kind of feedback, what kinds of things are you going to see teachers do who are approaching from an interactionist perspective? You will occasionally see that explicit negative feedback. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes I use it myself. Not very often. It's at least in U.S. classrooms and by teachers who've been U.S. trained. It's not used very often. So it's not gone away. It's still around, but it's not used as much. So what kinds of things do you see the teacher doing? There is, in our module, after this lecture, I have a worksheet for you to take a look at, and it's called Operational Definitions and Classifications. And you don't have to have it with you right now, but I just want you to kind of connect that with this part of the lecture. And so there are 3 different ways that teachers principally respond in an interactionist classroom. And the first is what's called a recast. The first is what's called a recast. And a recast is when a student says something to you, and I've got some examples on that worksheet. For example, a student says, "I go to cinema at weekend." And in this classroom, there's a focus on meaning, right? There's a focus on teachers and students and students and students actually using language to accomplish something. And so the focus is more on meaning than it is on form. There's still some focus on form, but there's more focus on meaning. Whereas in that behaviorist classroom, lots of focus on form. Form is a fancy way of saying the right vocabulary, the right grammar, and that is, of course, grammatical competency. But here there's a focus on meaning. And so if a student said, I go to cinema at weekend, if a teacher were to carry out a recast, the teacher would say back to the student, as if kind of confirming that they understood what they were saying, but correcting the form. So if the student said, I go to cinema at weekend, then the teacher might say, oh, you went to the cinema. What did you see? And so you notice with that, the student is given some very implicit means it's kind of not hidden exactly, but it's not right on the surface. It's not entirely clear. So they're given some kind of implicit signal. And also they're being given some input, maybe it even becomes intake, right? That responds directly to the way that they're struggling a little bit with word choice or with a bit of grammar, with a tense, for example. And so that is a recast. And those are the types of responses that teachers predominantly give in a language classroom. What other kinds of things do they do? The second most prevalent is what's called in the literature a prompt. And a prompt is when the teacher gives some kind of signal to the student that what they said just wasn't quite correct or wasn't quite understandable. And you'll see when you get to the worksheet that's waiting for you, there are several different kinds of prompts that teachers tend to use. Sometimes it will be a teacher saying, now how do we say that in English? Right? So the student is telling you a story, they went to the movies over the weekend, and you might stop them and say, how do we say that in English? Or you might say, we don't say it like that in English. So it's a little more, it's direct, but it's not necessarily telling the student how to reform the utterance. And another thing that can happen is that the teacher can say, now remember, you're talking about the past tense, right? Oh, you what to the cinema, right? So you can kind of prompt in that way as well. It can also be kind of a clarification request, like, pardon? Or what did you say? What? That kind of thing. So again, giving a little bit of indirect feedback on what the problem really was. And the final kind of prompt that happens is to say back to the student exactly their sentence, but correct it, right? So we know that a recast, if a student says to you, I go to cinema at weekend, if you recast, you might say, oh, you went to the cinema. What did you see? So you're saying it back, but you're switching the pronoun, right? You're not saying it as if you just said their sentence. This type of a prompt, this kind of prompt, you say it back exactly. So the student says, I go to cinema at weekend, and you say, oh, I went to the cinema on the weekend, right? So you just say it back that directly. That's the most direct correction that happens with a prompt. And then the final kind is that explicit, which, as I mentioned, it happens less and less, and not very often in language classrooms that the teacher is approaching from this model. But it still happens. So what do we know from the research about which is more helpful? So when we look at our research, let me pull up my findings. So one thing that we know when we look at the research is we know that of all three kinds of feedback feedback that teachers tend to give students on their speaking in classrooms, recasts happen the most. So this is number one. Prompts happen second, and explicit correction or explicit negative correction, that's number three. And one thing that we know is that with recasts, the studies that have been done in which the teacher kind of put him or herself on lockdown for a quarter and didn't allow any recasts at all, didn't carry them out, versus the same teacher or a different teacher with a different group using recasts, when you compare the speaking at the end of that session, that semester, that quarter, whatever, recasts do make a difference in the speaking ability of the students, especially around grammatical issues. So recasts do make a difference. Although research comes out in different ways. Some research says it hardly makes a difference at all, and other research it says it makes quite a big difference. So there's some disagreement there. But one thing you can take away is, yeah, do it. It does make a difference. Now, when we talk about, I left out a word we should talk about. When we talk about teachers putting all this work into giving some kind of feedback to students, or students carrying out noticing, students carrying out negotiation of meaning, a word that has to enter our vocabulary is what's called uptake. And that means that when you carry out output, you speak, and then you get some kind of feedback that gives you an idea of how you should change your output, you're able to do something with that. That is uptake. So for example, if a student says to you, I go to a movie this weekend, and you choose to use a recast, oh, you went to the movies this weekend. Did you like the movie? And then uptake would be following that student over the next minute, the next hour, the next couple of days, and seeing if the next time they talk about the past with that particular verb, go, to see if they switch it to the past tense. To see if, for example, if they turn to their neighbor and say, oh, I went to see Gladiators this weekend, or whatever. That would be uptake. So that's a key word, and that's really what we're after here. That's why we put all that work into responding to our students in some way, is to hope that there's uptake. So the reason I present that word now is because most of the research that looks at recast says there is some uptake, but it's lower than we would hope. We would hope that there would be more. Okay. And another thing that has been found is that when there's a difference between when teachers use both recasts and prompts, or when there's an actual study done where you've got 4 groups of students, they're all the same level, they're the same number of students, 15, 15, 15, 15. All the teachers are very similar education, very similar approach on things. When you have a teacher who only does recasts, right, by design, and I cannot imagine doing that, by the way. I cannot imagine tying myself to only being able to respond to my students in one way. But when you have a teacher who only does recasts, when you have a teacher who only does the prompts that are the less direct, and then you have a teacher who gives the prompts that are more direct, and then you have a 4th teacher who does nothing, the teacher who does the more direct prompts actually comes out on top. That's one thing that we're finding in research. And then who comes in second? Recasts. Recasts come in second. So when, after this lecture, when you explore the material, when you do your reading and you explore the material that I have waiting for you, take a look at those different kinds, that 4 different kinds of prompts, and just kind of practice them yourself. Get comfortable in the kinds of things that you might say. And most of you, if not all of you, are in some kind of practicum situation, or you're tutoring, or you're doing something right now. What I'd like you to do is to start noticing, how are you responding? Are you only recasting, or are you also prompting, that kind of thing? And you might actually want to print out the page about different kinds of prompts and keep it with you the next time you're working with a student, and just see if you can't try some different ways to explore giving feedback. Because we know the more explicit prompts that you can give, it's more likely to make a difference. Okay? So those are some things that we know. Some other things that I wanted to share with you that we know from research is, can't find my notes. We know that from studies of classrooms, we know that when students are carrying out negotiation of meaning, there are actually 3 different functions happening. There's 3 different ways that students attempt to repair communication. And there's also, this is waiting for you in your module, it's called Interaction and the Negotiation of Meaning. And the reason I chose it is, it has a really nice list, very simple, and you may only want to look at these 3 bulleted points if you don't have much time. If you have a little more time, take a look at what actual, real conversations with students look like, and it might give you a sense of how these really play out. But there are 3 ways that when there's some kind of breakdown in communication, in negotiation of meaning, that students attempt to fix it. One is called a confirmation check. And this is when often what we do is we repeat back what the student said, but we make a rising intonation. Like, let's say that I'm talking to a student about how they are getting to school every day. And they say a word, and it sounds like bus, but the B doesn't quite sound like a B, and maybe the vowel doesn't at all sound like the sound. And so I might say what I think they meant and say bus, right? You took the bus, and that is a confirmation check, okay? A clarification request is that functional language that we teach students, and you might be in classrooms, and if you're not, you should be, in which the functional language is up on the board. Things like, please repeat that for me, or please speak more slowly, or I don't understand. Those kinds of functional language students can grab onto to indicate, help, I don't understand, I need a little assistance here. Those are called clarification requests. And then you have comprehension checks. These are my favorite because, probably because it indicates an empathetic speaker. So let's say you and I are speaking in Spanish, and I say something that, you say something to me in Spanish, and your Spanish is better, and you want to make sure I understood, and so you check with me. Like, did you understand? You asked me in Spanish. Did you understand that? Are you following me? That kind of thing. So it's kind of reaching out with your hand to make sure that the listener is able to understand what you're saying. And so all 3 of those show up in the research around negotiation of meaning. Why does that matter for you? It matters because when you're moving around your classroom, whether that's in Japan or the US, whether it's 3rd graders in Wenatchee or adults in Spokane, no matter where it is, you need to have kind of a sense of what's going on with the communication happening between your students. And this kind of gives you a framework of the kind of things that you're going to be hearing. Some other things that I wanted to mention. I wanted to mention that when we are following the interactionist model, when we are approaching from this idea that we absolutely need our students producing some kind of output, it's not just that our students will be developing accuracy, right? So the examples I've been giving to you, they're all students needing to fix maybe their pronunciation of bus, or to use the past tense, went instead of go, to use an article, or to use the correct preposition, that kind of thing. And so, so obviously, this uptake can influence accuracy, but also another thing that can happen through this interaction is students are actually developing fluency. And we talked briefly that very first week about fluency, and we also talked about it with writing. And accuracy is getting something correct, maybe 100% correct, maybe correct enough. And fluency is being able to do it quickly and easily. And so one thing that we know is that in our classrooms, we need our students speaking a lot more than we speak, because they need to be moving forward both with accuracy and fluency, and both of these will be impacted by students producing through negotiation of meaning, through noticing, from the feedback that they're getting from the teacher. They will be moving forward with all of that. So some other things I wanted to mention is that when we approach from an interactionist perspective, and we're assuming that we're going to create a classroom where students are talking a lot, we really need to distinguish. We've got this word practice over here. Whoa, let me turn it. There we go. Here it is, the word practice. We've got this word practice over here, which I suggested that we bring with us, even though I'm not suggesting that you approach speaking from a behaviorist model. But I'm suggesting we import this idea of practice. Because I do think, for those of you who've been in AUAP classrooms, you've seen a lot of practice. You've seen students practicing saying a word over and over again, or you've seen students say a piece of functional language a few times before they actually use it in the classroom. So practice does matter, and we need to bring it with us, but that's not what's going on in an interactionist perspective. In an interactionist classroom, what you've got really going on most of the time is language use. So one of the things that you need to take away from this lecture, and you'll get a chance to try it out in the module, because I've got two kind of sets of activities there, and I want you to take a look at them and figure out which ones are going to support the skill of speaking, and which ones are actually language use, not language practice. So you're going to get to try this out. But we need to talk a little bit about that difference. What is language practice? Language practice is when students are simply wrapping their lips around saying words. They are saying sentences out loud, and there is no purpose at all except for the purpose of them uttering those sentences. Nothing happens with the language. It doesn't change the world. It doesn't tell anyone anything. And there's no real communication. So that's language practice. Does it matter? Yeah, we need it, but only a very small amount of your classroom time needs to be spent, should be spent on language practice. Language use. What does language use look like? Language use looks like what happens outside of your classroom when students use language. When I go to a restaurant and I use language, I get the food that I want to eat. I get my water refilled if that's what I want. When I go to, when I'm a student in a classroom and I don't understand something, I can impact the lecture so that the teacher repeats or re-explains something. When I am meeting up with friends for lunch, when I really use language and they're in the real world, at the end of that time, I have expressed things to my friends. They know things about me, or they know things about my week, or they know things that I'm challenged by right now that they didn't know before. So they walk away with information that they didn't have before, right? And maybe I've even gotten help. Maybe I've changed the world because now I've got my friends who are going to help me with some tasks that I'm really struggling with. Language use is not about language. Language use changes the world. Language practice is all about just practice. So for example, if you give your students some dialogues and you ask them, you put them into pairs and you have them each reading the lines, one is A, one is B, is that language practice or is that language use? Language practice. Doesn't change a thing in the world, right? And even one of the students could refuse to participate and the other student could just keep going or read all the lines. It doesn't change a thing. It's simply a physical action of producing language, but it doesn't change the world. What if you have students hide something, each of them hides something in the classroom, and then they figure out how they can give directions to a partner. And then they're assigned a partner, they give those directions, and the student who's listening to those spoken directions, they either get to the object or they don't. There's either success or there isn't. Is that language use or language practice? Language use. It's not about those directions. The directions are a means to an end. Can a student use language to do something in the world, to actually get someone to find something that's hidden in the classroom? So this is a really key point, and it's also really important for you to know the difference, because in the real world, people don't talk about the difference between language practice and language use. In fact, the activities that I have waiting for you to see if you can tell the difference, one of the links is entirely called language practice. Well, you need to decide which of those are practice and which of those are use, if any, okay? So that needs to be something that you're armed with, because I haven't seen anything out there that really is going to help you tell the difference. And next week, when we look at how to structure your lessons, we'll have lots of ideas about how do you create a situation in which students really carry out, they do something with language in the world. So that's waiting for you as well. And as a matter of fact, the chapter that you need to read for this week in your textbook, on page 176, there's an example of language use activity waiting for you. So take a look at that. That's a spoiler alert. Anything else that I wanted to mention to you? I wanted to talk, maybe I'm going to move this. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about levels, about how language changes for students as they first begin to speak in English and then moving into being able to speak fluently. And so the thing is that no matter where you go, they are going to have some kind of framework and some kind of name, some kind of categories that they've got for the earliest levels of English, being able to produce, and then starting to be able to produce a little bit more, becoming a little more advanced, and then students who almost sound like native speakers of English. So there's the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, which have been the gold standard for a long time for those of us who teach outside of the U.S., or we teach a foreign language like Spanish. And so one of the things that I'll have you do after this lecture is to go to the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. We already took a look at those in an earlier class time, but I want you to go to, and I think I've got the link right, go to the speaking portion for English and choose to listen to all three of the samples for what's called novice and all three of the samples for what's called intermediate. Okay, just to kind of let your ears start to hear and read the descriptions to give you a sense of how that develops. And if you're headed to K through 12, some good news is that more and more of the states are buying into the ELPA program, including Washington, Oregon, California, and many other states. I think there's 21 or 22 now, are all starting to use kind of a shared framework in talking about English language learners. And one place that I will send you after this is to send you to, it's actually California's link, but ours is the same, to go to, and it'll be marked which page, the proficiency level descriptors, and for the productive skills, meaning speaking, here our focus is on speaking, to take a look at how those change, and to take a look at the names that they've been called in K through 12. So the bad news is wherever you go, there's going to be different category names. And even those category names get changed over time. So Washington State, we just changed ours just this year. So what can you hold on to? Where's the solid ground? That's what I'm going to share with you. And it's really the important piece to hold on to is, as you're watching a non-speaker become a speaker, what's changing? So one thing that you're going to see is you're going to see students starting out with everyday language that's about real things, everyday activities. And they'll first be able to talk about those. And then they'll move towards being able to talk about more and more abstract, academic, really kind of a lot of cognitive load, cognitive challenge kinds of topics. So moving from the everyday to the academic. Another thing that you will see is moving from the concrete to, and I just kind of hinted at this, moving to the abstract. So for a student who is just beginning to speak in English, they will be talking about the things that are right here, and you'll be able to elicit talk from them about things that are right here, like the clothes that they're wearing, the pen that you are asking them to pick up, their desk, the floor, the ceiling, things that are concrete and right here. So I end up using a lot of pictures with beginning language learners, because you can't, I do bring in bags and bags of what are called realia, but you can't haul in everything, right? You can't haul in a kitchen. So you can bring in a picture of a kitchen. So students start out there with the very concrete, and then they are moving more and more in the direction of being able to talk about really abstract ideas. They also start out at one-word answers, and they get longer and longer utterances. And utterances is a fancy way of saying something someone says, right? So if I get up and I give a 1.5 minute speech, that is a 1.5 minute utterance. Fancy name, okay, same thing. So you'll see students begin to answer with one word, right? And sometimes that one word is yes or no. For some students, it's, they begin to answer with nouns, with simple words like color, right? Do you want the pink crayon or the blue to start with? Blue. Okay, so you give it to them. So you'll see them start to do that, and then they're beginning to string some phrases together, and then they're beginning to say sentences, and then they're beginning to participate in longer and longer communication, longer and longer talks that they're able to give in front of the class, more and more that they're able to participate in longer discussions with others, until it seems almost limitless, right? I mean, a lot of us are talkers. We can just keep going. We also see them moving from memorized and familiar material, to unfamiliar, unknown, and creative. Right? So for me, in my Spanish, I'm really able to talk, at least once I've been back in Nicaragua for a few days, I'm able to talk about my family and about where I teach in the U.S. and where I help in Nicaragua and which towns I've been to, which ones I haven't, what kinds of foods I like in Nicaragua, what kind of foods I like in the U.S., that kind of thing. So I'm really doing great as a beginner. But the longer I push myself, the longer I have intake and I have uptake in my Spanish, and the more that I'm participating and noticing and negotiation of meaning, and I'm getting recasts and prompts from others who are helping me, the more I will be able to create with language, say things that I haven't actually heard, right? So I'm no longer just repeating something that I've kind of internalized, some functional language, and trying out new things. Trying out things that I've read, but I haven't heard anyone say yet. So that's kind of a move as well. Another thing that we see, and it's really related to the concrete, but I really kind of want to emphasize this because this has a lot of implication for us as teachers. We move from, just as I mentioned with the concrete, we move from needing lots and lots of prompts to express ourselves to not needing any prompts at all, any prompts. And what do I mean by prompts? So my very first presentation that I gave in Spanish when I was taking Spanish 101, actually it was in Spanish 102 now that I think about it. I was asked to present about Nicaragua and the culture of Nicaragua. And so what I did for each slide was I chose a rich picture that would support students, the other students understanding me, even if my Spanish failed me, like if I couldn't remember a word or if my pronunciation was not comprehensible, that kind of thing. So with that first talk, lots and lots of very rich pictures, almost a one-to-one correspondence with what I wanted to talk about. And now, when I introduce myself at a conference, when it's in Nicaragua, I always start in Spanish. I think there's a lot of meaning in that, and it's a good chance for me to kind of try it out myself. I don't have any props at all. I'm just talking about myself, and it's true, it is that very familiar language, and some of it is somewhat memorized. Occasionally people will ask questions about me that I may not know, have a memorized response to. But still, I am moving towards not using any props at all. So there's a big implication there for us as teachers in terms of thinking about if your curriculum calls for all students to give a presentation, thinking about how you could support students who are farther on this end, letting them use props to support and express themselves. And by the way, the idea of props or no props and concrete and abstract, this should get you thinking about Jim Cummins' research around context-reduced and contextualized language. Remember, he was the one to talk about Bix and Calp, and he was the one to find that the reason that Calp is so often so challenging in our classrooms is because we decontextualize it. We make it context-reduced, he said. So for any student who's struggling, adding that context in almost any of these ways will assist them. So, so what I want you to do to kind of act on this, do something with this part, is now that I've given you the ways that language changes from non-speaker to fluent speaker, I want you to take a look at two things. Go to the ACTFL guidelines, just like I mentioned, look at the speaking samples, and take a look at the descriptors about why the students were either categorized as novice or as intermediates, and then take a look at the page that I've indicated for the proficiency guidelines K-12, take a look at the productive skills, and take a look at how that matches up as well and how they describe that movement, starting from a true beginner, a novice, moving over as well. Okay. So there's also a list of terms that I've covered on this lecture that's waiting for you in the module, and head into your textbook reading. Head into the pieces that are waiting there, some exploration activities, some videos to watch, and hear some language. And I will meet you in the discussion. See you then.